CCP leader Xi Jinping has allegedly been declared the core leader of the Communist Party, increasing his control over China. Also, the Chinese Communist Party is recognizing its anniversary of its takeover in China. And on the evening of September 30th, the regime's State Council held a reception in Beijing. Yet key CCP leaders were absent during the reception. I'll be looking into what's happening. During the first 2020 US presidential debate, President Donald Trump was accused of not condemning white nationalism. But this is disinformation. I'll be going in-depth into this, showing the context of what actually took place. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. CCP leader Xi Jinping has allegedly been declared the core leader of the Communist Party. This increases his control over China. RFA reported that the group of party leaders in the Politburo approved an amendment that named Xi as the party's core leader. And he's also now inscribed in the regulations on the work of the Central Committee, which means he will hold power indefinitely. This finalizes a process that began with him eliminating term limits back in March 2018. Now, as we mentioned previously, just having this term limit eliminated, just having that position, does not give Xi Jinping complete power over the Chinese Communist Party. This solidifies his role within the party head position. In other words, he could keep that position but not really have influence within the Chinese Communist Party. But while this is happening, Xi Jinping is also bringing out some old Mao Zedong strategies that led to Mao Zedong eventually becoming chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. If Xi Jinping follows that exact same chain of incidents, if he follows the footsteps of Mao, very likely he could reach that same status. There's a lot of speculation this is what he's planning to do. If he were to become chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, this means absolute authority within the CCP. This means he controls everything. As things currently stand, again, while Xi Jinping is technically the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, he's the head of the Chinese Communist Party, there are different factions and different groups of power in China. Just having that position does not mean he controls everything. The chairman position would change that. This would give him absolute control over the CCP and over every arm of the Communist Party. Meanwhile, the CCP is recognizing its anniversary of taking power over China on October 1st. And on the evening of September 30th, the Chinese Communist Party's State Council, technically the government of China, held a reception in Beijing. Yet the reception itself showed something interesting. Key CCP leaders were absent, and questions are now being raised as to why. NTD reported that in an 8-minute video aired by party mouthpiece channel CCTV, there was no footage showing former CCP heads Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, or a few other key top members of their political factions. At the same time, CCP heads that haven't been seen for a long time showed up at the event. Among them were the former vice chairman of the CCP, the Secretary Political and Legal Committee, and also the former Navy commander. Also notable was that none of the close to 500 participants, including foreigners, appeared to have worn masks for the event. Now, what are we seeing here? When it comes to these top former CCP members, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, not showing up for this event, marking the CCP's takeover of China, this is one of the main events recognizing the power of the CCP over China. You would expect the top leaders, the former top leaders of all people, to show up for this. And so when it comes to China, how they would analyze these things, this will be interpreted in terms of infighting within the CCP. Now, Jiang Zemin especially, we've mentioned before, he's the head of a main political faction opposed to Xi Jinping's faction. Jiang Zemin rose to power through the Tiananmen Square massacre. He was the mastermind of the persecution of Falun Gong. His party, his entire faction, has a lot of blood on its hands. And again, when it comes to the CCP, one of the main divisions of power, one of the main parts of infighting within it, has been between Jiang Zemin and Xi Jinping. Jiang Zemin not showing up to this event raises some questions. Why did he not show up? Does this mean that he wasn't invited? Does it mean he chose to not show up? Does it mean he's facing health problems? Any of these could have pretty deep implications when it comes to Xi Jinping's rise to power again, reaching the chairman status, which would give him absolute control over the CCP. Jiang Zemin's faction would be one of the main factions trying to block that from happening. And when it comes to these masks, again, no individual at this party seemed to be wearing face masks. The Chinese Communist Party has been sending mixed messages. On one side, they're still doing lockdowns. They're still locking down different parts of China. For example, in Xinjiang, where they have the Muslim Uyghurs, they have almost total lockdowns, martial law in some areas. In different parts of China, they have lockdowns, almost full lockdowns, but they're not calling them lockdowns. And at the same time as this, while they're dealing with alleged outbreaks of the virus in many parts of China, they're telling the world the CCP has declared victory over the virus. They're reopening travel to China. They're reopening tourism. So the CCP is sending mixed messages. Within China, they still have lockdowns. Within China, they're still, for example, chaining people outside of their homes for violating quarantines. Within China, the Chinese people are still suffering because of this. But for the Chinese Communist Party and for its foreign messaging, it's declaring the virus is over. And as the Chinese Communist Party celebrates the anniversary of its takeover of China again, the country is reopening to tourism, but also police in Hong Kong are again making arrests of protesters who are standing up and speaking out against the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. And as the Chinese Communist Party celebrates the anniversary of its takeover of China again, the country is reopening to tourism, but also police in Hong Kong are again making arrests of protesters who are standing up and speaking out against the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. On the regime's National Day holiday, Hong Kong police arrested 60 people for alleged unauthorized assembly after a crowd gathered at a shopping district and shouted slogans calling for democracy in Hong Kong. Now, technically, Hong Kong is supposed to have democracy. Technically, this should not be something controversial under Hong Kong law and under the CCP's agreement for autonomy in Hong Kong. Now, AP reports that among those arrested were 2 district councillors, showing that different leaders in Hong Kong, not just students, are again opposing the CCP. This is no longer just a student protest. And what are we seeing here again? The Chinese Communist Party is making crackdowns on its holidays. Anytime the CCP celebrates its power, it finds it necessary to suppress individuals who speak out against it. Is that true power if you cannot withstand scrutiny? Is it true power if you can't withstand open debate? The Chinese Communist Party fears these things. When it comes to, for example, this individual at this Hong Kong subway station reading a copy of Apple Daily, a pro-democracy newspaper, why would the CCP, why would authorities there send police to surround the individual? When it comes to, for example, Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, where students and parents were speaking out against a Chinese language program, why would the Chinese Communist Party find it necessary to send its military in? These are minor protests by any international standard. But for the CCP, again, its image is so delicate that even minor things like this are seen as threats to its power. And meanwhile, in the United States, after the presidential debates on September 29th, Trump was accused of refusing to condemn white supremacists.
But are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you
I'm
prepared
willing to do
specific?
that.
Now, the main reference for this line is often Trump's statements following the violent clashes in Charlottesville, Virginia, back in 2017.
And you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And this was even noted during the debates and the questioning when it came to Biden, because Biden has campaigned on this.
The president was asked to comment on it. He said, quote, "There are very fine people on both sides."
But the framing of that story is false. Now let's take a look back. At the time, back in 2017, Trump condemned racism. He disavowed neo-Nazis, the KKK, and other hate groups by name.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence. It has no place in America. Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
Now, some of the fact-check sites have noted this as well. They've noted that President Donald Trump was misquoted on this. His quotes were taken out of context and misframed. Factcheck.org noted back in February that Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden wrongly claimed that Trump had not once condemned white supremacy. It notes, quote, "Contrary to Biden's claim, the the president twice specifically condemned white supremacists and neo-Nazis, and he has repeated that condemnation since. Now, ironically, many news outlets have taken Trump's statements after Charlottesville out of context. They've made it appear that Trump said the opposite, including in political advertisements by Biden, which were cited during the September 29th debate. This claim is that Trump said there were, quote, very fine people on both sides, which included neo-Nazis. Now, in the full context, Trump had stated on August 15, 2017 that, quote, you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides, referring both to the right and the left, and Antifa was on the left. But Trump had also stated,
you're changing history, you're changing culture, and you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits and with the helmets and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too.
Now, the fact that Trump's words have been taken out of context have also been noted by several news outlets. USA Today, for example, reported back in April that Biden and many news outlets had taken the statements out of context in order to frame their narrative. Now, what are we seeing here? This is classic disinformation. Yes, we can say it's political messaging. When, say, one political party wants to defame the other, and so they take quotes out of context, they take information out of context, and they change the implications of it. When it comes to disinformation, this is how it functions. They alter the footnotes of information. And once they alter the footnotes, they use it to make political arguments, to make surface arguments. So for example, here, they've altered the context of Trump's statements. They omitted key information, changing the meaning of what he said. Then they've used that altered meaning to make additional political arguments. They use that altered information as footnotes to make political arguments. And what does that function? They're making it seem that Trump supports white nationalism, when in reality, he condemned white nationalism. He condemned the KKK. He condemned these groups that these news outlets in that same quote are claiming that he supported. It is the opposite of what they're stating. But again, we're seeing here that this is not only just being used in media framing. It's not just being used to get clicks and to get people to subscribe to newspapers. This is being used to alter the political debate in the United States, at a time, notably, when race politics are dividing the nation. This is feeding into violence. This is feeding into notions that the President of the United States supports white nationalism, at a time when, again, this is becoming one of the biggest arguments in the country. The opposite is true. The opposite is what Trump stated. He condemned white nationalism. He condemned the KKK.
What are your views on the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists?
I totally disavow the Ku Klux Klan. I totally disavow David Duke. I've been doing it now for 2 weeks. You're probably about the 18th person that's asked me the question.
Now, this ties into something broader as well, which is memetics. Now, what are memetics? A lot of us think about memes, for example, these funny pictures on the internet. They make us laugh. A lot of times they have political implications. They're deeper than this. Memetics is the concept of how ideas can be introduced into a society, evolve over time, and eventually alter the culture of that society. The concept of memetics was introduced by radical atheist Richard Dawkins. And again, this is being used by different groups for what they call memetic warfare. And what is this? It is the intentional introduction of ideas into a society, the intentional alteration of these ideas in order to make them influence the culture in an intended way. For example, here we have the idea that Trump is a racist, the idea that Trump supports white nationalism. This is disinformation. Trump said the opposite many times. But this idea has again influenced the culture of the country. It's creating racial divisions. It's making people go to the polls and vote, using disinformation to make them make that decision on who will lead the country. This is memetics led by disinformation that has again altered the culture of the country to create this false concept over the nature of our political system. And now for the broader stories for today. Now, first off, the United States and China are fighting an economic and financial war. And as this battle develops, there's increasing focus on what China could potentially do with the American debt it owns. Now, a couple weeks back, the US Treasury Department declared that the budget deficit rose to a record high, of $3 trillion, adding to the $26.7 trillion debt in 2019. And this announcement followed reports from Chinese state media saying that the Chinese Communist Party may dump its holdings of US treasuries if tensions continue to grow between the two countries. Now, for the record, if it wasn't for the CCP virus, the US budget wouldn't be looking nearly as bad. The US is set to bring in around $3.7 trillion in taxes, but the country was hit hard by the virus and has already spent around $3 trillion on relief. And with the CCP now being called out for allowing the virus to spread globally, when it could have prevented this, things are now heating up even more so between the United States and China. Now, as the U.S. has turned to sanctions and other methods to hold the CCP accountable for that, Chinese authorities are looking for whatever leverage they can find to strike back against the United States. Among the tools they're threatening to use now is China's holding of U.S. debt. Now, as we've mentioned before, the CCP is saying China may reduce its holdings of U.S. debt from around $1 trillion to around $800 billion. And in this propaganda, they're playing this up as a major blow to the United States. But how big of a deal is it really? Now, to put this into perspective, around $7.04 trillion in U.S. debt is held by other countries. China holds the second largest amount of this, just behind Japan, which holds about $1.2 trillion. Now, the majority of the debt held internally within the United States is the Federal Reserve. It owns about half of U.S. debt. The rest goes to state and local governments, to big insurance companies, to big companies, and so on. Now, even before the CCP virus outbreak, the Chinese regime was already starting to dump its holdings of U.S. debt, going back to 2013 with its peak at around $1.32 trillion. Now, I'm sure most of us have heard the rumors, heard people saying that China owns America's debt and that it could crash the U.S. economy if it wanted to. Well, Chinese state media are pushing a similar narrative right now. They're saying that holding U.S. debt gives the CCP power, and that if China were to reduce its holdings of U.S. debt, it could bring grave consequences against the United States. Now, among the claims it's making is that by dropping around $200 billion in U.S. securities, it could destabilize the financial market globally and push the interest rates even higher. But this doesn't appear to hold true. Actually, such a move would likely hurt China a lot more than the United States. Now, aside from keeping the money within China's own economy, which would again devalue its own currency, the CCP would have two other options. One would be to use the money to buy securities in other countries, which would devalue the other country's currency instead. Or it could put the money back into U.S. investments, which would negate any intended impact on the U.S. economy. And on top of this, were China to sell off U.S. treasuries, it's likely other buyers would step in quickly, which means the impact on the U.S. would be almost nothing. Now, several investors have pointed this out previously. We've also discussed it on this show. Now, a recent analysis by the Asian investor makes the point that the most realistic impact would be that the U.S. Federal Reserve, which is already the largest holder of U.S. debt by far, would very likely buy up the new debt almost immediately. Now, if this were to happen, it points out that in addition to this, the Federal Reserve could also use quantitative easing to offset any growing debt in the market. So again, the impact would be almost nothing. It also points out that since the outbreak of the CCP virus, the Federal Reserve has already been buying up U.S. debt after the U.S. Treasury put its stimulus into the economy. Now, the Asian investor also notes, quote, in an extreme case were China to sell an enormous quantity of U.S. government bonds, the U.S. could conceivably cancel them. This is based on speculation that the Federal Reserve could default on bonds that China wants to sell. This is in addition to the fact, as we mentioned again on the show previously, that the U.S. also holds Chinese debt, going back to before the CCP took power, and which the Chinese regime hasn't paid a penny of. Were the United States to hold China accountable to this, approximately $1.6 trillion now, it would cancel out China's holdings of U.S. debt with money left to spare. But this plays into an even deeper picture, that of Chinese propaganda and the types of narratives it pushes through its state media. As the Asian Investor notes, following the 2008 global recession, the CCP was pushing propaganda that its model of so-called socialism with Chinese characteristics was the most capable of dealing with global economic fallout. And now we're seeing the regime push the same narrative with the global impact of the CCP virus. Only now it's using the term state capitalism to describe its system, pulling a term for socialism that was used by Vladimir Lenin shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, that was under its narrative of a, quote, state capitalist monopoly. Yet things aren't always as they seem with the Chinese Communist Party, and it's even less so when it comes to what it claims. As we discussed on the show before, the way the Chinese Communist Party weathered the 2008 economic crisis was through a massive stimulus that grew its GDP by 9.4% in 2019. Business Insider noted the results of this, that China's total debt grew to 303% of its GDP, and notes that while the regime is pulling some of these same levers to try to revitalize its economy now, it's engaging in things, again, like ideological warfare, economic warfare, psychological warfare, and other methods to, quote, sustain this facade of Chinese hope. Now, what does that mean? The Chinese Communist Party is talking about how great its economy is, how well things move, how it's the best system in place to deal with things like this. It weathered the storm through a stimulus, a massive stimulus, that had long-term impacts on its economy. The Chinese Communist Party being a state capitalist monopoly, a socialist state, socialism with Chinese characteristics, whatever you want to call it, again is able to manipulate internal markets like this and tell the world whatever it wants when it comes to the value of its own currency. But at the same time as claiming this economic success, the Chinese Communist Party has been using dishonest means like economic theft in order to keep things moving. And again, they're turning to other methods, such as these debt traps when it comes to going to other countries, and also these mega projects like ghost cities to keep money flowing internally in China. Now, the Epoch Times explained that even going beyond propaganda and saving face, there's something deeper at play with moves like this. For the CCP, economic downturn is an opportunity to gain more control over private industry, both in China and abroad. Its narrative about this, again, the rise of the state-led economy, is a narrative it uses by its elites to legitimize its increasing state control through big government, interventionist policies, and state-owned monopolies. Now, a lot of Chinese experts have pointed out that the Chinese economy functions like a Ponzi scheme. They can say whatever they want when it comes to numbers. They can say whatever they want when it comes to GDP growth. And one of the big looming disasters right now for the Chinese economy is that different Chinese companies on the US stock exchange are going to be audited. The CCP used to protect them from this. The Trump administration says they can no longer do that. If they begin auditing them, this is going to show the nature of this economic Ponzi scheme the Chinese Communist Party has been running. And again, we've seen several Chinese companies get taken down like this already, publicly listed Chinese companies. This is one of the looming disasters for the CCP. Now, to keep their economy alive, again, they're using mega projects and the Belt and Road Initiative, pouring money into these loans to build these big projects, getting countries locked into debt traps. This is not a legitimate economy. And again, another big factor on this, a big part of the Chinese economy when it comes to numbers, its current state of things, has been deeply reliant on economic theft, deeply reliant on intellectual property theft. Now that is being pulled out from under them. What is going to happen to the Chinese economy when its different companies and innovation have been dependent on stealing these things from other companies and other countries? What is going to be the impact on the Chinese economy now that that rug has been pulled out from under them? Now, meanwhile, China just held a secretive launch of a Long March 4B rocket near midnight on September 26 in northern Shanxi Province. It was allegedly carrying 2 remote sensing satellites into orbit, which were HJ-2A and HJ-2B models. SpaceNews notes that the regime broke its standard protocol in this launch. While the CCP rarely publicly announces its launches ahead of time, it usually publishes airspace closures a few days before the launches, basically to make sure aircraft aren't flying over the area. But this time, however, the Chinese Communist Party did not publish any notices. The outside world was notified about the launches only afterwards through an announcement by a state-owned company, China Aerospace Sciences and Technology Corp., CASC. Now, Chinese state media Xinhua reported that the 2 new satellites are for environmental monitoring, including for monitoring natural disasters, quake emergency rescue, dynamic monitoring of crop areas and assessment yield, and for other purposes. This does raise some suspicions, again, that the CCP is monitoring the situation of natural disasters that have swept across the country, and also concerns of crop shortages. Now, as for the secretive late-night launch and why the CCP took the risk of not publishing an airspace closure, it's possible this has to do with the public image disaster from another rocket launch earlier this month. Now, you may remember on September 7th, after the CCP successfully launched another Long March 4B rocket, also carrying an Earth imaging satellite, videos went viral as parts of the rocket rained down on a nearby village, narrowly missed a school, and created a cloud of yellow toxic fumes from the rocket propellant. And so again, with the cover-up of this launch, with the secretive launch, very likely the Chinese Communist Party chose to do this at midnight instead of midday, and also to not issue notifications ahead of time because they don't want a PR disaster when parts of it rain down again. Again, it's the same type of rocket, the same model. And on a related note to this, when it comes to the CCP monitoring the country's agricultural situation, Chinese farmers are now asking for government help, as the heavy rains and floods have destroyed rice crops through central and southern China. Now, is this why they're again launching satellites to monitor the crop situation? Possibly. Now, Epoch Times spoke with farmers through phone interviews who revealed that large harvests were lost to the floods and heavy rains through southern and central China. In Shanxi Province in eastern China, for example, there are usually 2 planting seasons. The first is in May with a harvest in June, and the second is in August with a harvest in October. Yet because of the floods, the first season's crops were ruined. Now, there are ongoing concerns of potential food shortages in China. The Chinese Communist Party has been downplaying this, just saying there's no such thing as food shortages. But at the same time, Xi Jinping launched this Clean Plates program, encouraging people to not waste food and to again becoming, say, conscious or aware of the issue of food security. Also, the Chinese Communist Party is dealing with many issues like this. 1, the floods, 2, the heavy rains, 3, the dry spells, 4, the locusts, and also 5, the issue of countries not shipping as many products to China because they're again holding their own assets when it comes to the virus. The Chinese Communist Party is not doing so well with this. But again, internally they're saying there's no food crisis. The crop shortages stayed otherwise. Again, we'll have to see what happens going forward. Now, with that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, and I also do a live video show on a Q&A on Sundays. So be sure to tune in for that. Also, if you want to support us, please consider joining us on Patreon. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. If you haven't already, also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel. If you want to go the extra mile, as I always mention, you can tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. Also, please consider sharing this video. Now, with that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.